On a quiet morning in 1898, along the peaceful shore of Lake Geneva, a veiled woman walked toward a small steamship. Few people recognized her. Yet this quiet traveler had once been the most famous beauty in Europe. She was Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to history as Sisi. But by the end of her life, she no longer lived like a queen. She wandered across Europe alone, avoiding the palace she once ruled. And on that quiet morning in Geneva, her long journey was about to end. A man rushed toward her, a flash of metal, a single strike, and moments later, the Empress of Austria collapsed beside the lake. To understand how Europe's most beautiful queen came to die beside a quiet lake in Switzerland, we must go back to the beginning, to a girl who never imagined she would become empress. Elizabeth was born in 1837 in Munich, into the Bavarian royal family. Her father, Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria, loved travel, music, and adventure. Unlike the strict courts of Europe, their household was relaxed and informal. Elizabeth grew up riding horses through forests, writing poetry, and wandering freely through the countryside. She disliked strict rules and formal behavior. Nature and freedom were what made her happiest. No one expected this quiet and dreamy girl to become one of the most powerful women in Europe. But in 1853, during a visit to the Austrian spa town of Bad Ischl, her life changed forever. There she met the young Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph. The meeting had originally been arranged so that the emperor might marry Elizabeth's older sister. Instead, he fell deeply in love with Elizabeth. He later declared that he would marry no one else. Within days, their engagement was announced. The shy Bavarian girl would become Empress of Austria. For Franz Joseph, it was a love story. For Elizabeth, it was the beginning of a life she had never imagined. Franz Joseph adored his young wife. Throughout his life, he remained deeply devoted to her. He wrote her countless letters and rarely criticized her, even when she spent long periods far from Vienna. Historians often describe him as a man who loved his wife sincerely, but love alone could not bridge the difference between their worlds. Franz Joseph was raised to believe that duty to the empire came above all else. From early morning until late at night, he worked tirelessly as emperor. Elizabeth, however, longed for freedom. She disliked formal ceremonies and the rigid expectations of court life. The problem was not her husband, it was the court itself. And no one represented that world more strongly than the emperor's mother. Franz Joseph's mother, Archduchess Sophie of Austria, was a powerful and disciplined woman. She believed the imperial court must maintain strict traditions. To her, Elizabeth seemed immature and unprepared to be empress. Sophie quickly took control of many aspects of the young couple's life. Even Elizabeth's children were placed under Sophie's supervision. For Elizabeth, this was heartbreaking. She felt as though her own children had been taken away. The conflict between the free-spirited young empress and the rigid imperial court grew stronger with each passing year. Yet Sophie herself was only part of the problem. Behind her stood an entire world of imperial tradition, a court whose rules had been refined over centuries. For a young woman who had grown up wandering freely through the forests of Bavaria, this world could feel almost impossible to endure. The Austrian court in Vienna was one of the most formal and structured courts in Europe. Centuries of tradition had created an environment where every movement was governed by etiquette. There were rules for everything. Rules for clothing, rules for meals, rules for conversation, rules for where one could sit, and even who one was allowed to speak to. At official dinners, every guest had an assigned place. The order of seating reflected rank and importance. One could not simply speak freely with anyone nearby. Conversation itself followed an invisible hierarchy. Clothing was equally regulated. The type of dress worn at court depended on the occasion, the time of day, and the presence of the emperor. Jewelry, hairstyles, gloves, and even the length of a train could follow strict expectations. Even the act of approaching the emperor required a precise ritual. For those raised within the system, such rules were simply part of life. But for Elisabeth, who had grown up wandering freely through the Bavarian countryside, the court felt suffocating. She once described court life as unbearably restrictive. To her, the palace did not feel like a home. It felt like a cage. The endless ceremonies, the constant observation, the rigid expectations. It was a world in which she felt she could barely breathe, and so she escaped whenever she could. Travel became her refuge. Away from Vienna, she could ride horses across open landscapes, walk freely along the sea, and live without the constant weight of imperial protocol. In many ways, Elisabeth spent much of her life trying to reclaim the freedom she had known as a child. Yet the crown she wore made that freedom impossible. And perhaps it was this constant tension between duty and freedom that shaped the strange and fascinating life of Empress Elisabeth. Despite her struggles within the imperial court, Elisabeth soon became famous throughout Europe. Her beauty captivated artists, photographers, and admirers everywhere. Portraits of the young empress spread across the continent, and many considered her one of the most beautiful women of her age. But this beauty was not effortless. Elisabeth devoted extraordinary time and discipline to maintaining her appearance. Her long brown hair, which reached nearly to her ankles, became legendary. Caring for it was a lengthy ritual. Hairdressers sometimes spent 3 hours brushing and arranging it, strand by strand, while the empress sat patiently reading or writing. She was equally strict about her physical condition. Elisabeth followed highly controlled diets and exercised constantly. Horse riding, fencing, long walks, and gymnastics became part of her daily routine. Some days she ate little more than fruit, milk, or broth. To many observers, these habits seemed unusual, even obsessive. Yet for Elisabeth, they represented something deeper. In a life governed by rigid court rules and endless expectations, these routines were one of the few areas she could control. But even beauty and discipline could not bring her peace. Elisabeth disliked public ceremonies and avoided court appearances whenever possible. Instead, she began to travel. England, Hungary, Greece, Italy. Wherever she went, she preferred open landscapes to palace halls. Away from Vienna, she could ride for hours, walk beside the sea, and live with a sense of freedom that the imperial court could never offer. Over time, her journeys grew longer and more frequent. The Empress of Austria had become something unusual in European royalty, a queen who was rarely at home in her own empire. And slowly, people began to describe her with a curious title, the Wandering Empress. Among all her children, Elisabeth shared the closest bond with her only son. He was Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria. Rudolf was intelligent, curious, and deeply thoughtful. Like his mother, he often felt uncomfortable within the rigid traditions of the imperial court. Both of them possessed a more questioning and independent spirit than the world around them allowed. They shared a love of literature, ideas, and long conversations that stretched beyond the formal expectations of court life. Many historians believe Elisabeth saw something of herself in her son. But Rudolf's relationship with his father was far more difficult. Franz Joseph believed the Crown Prince must grow into a disciplined military leader and future ruler. Rudolf, however, held more liberal political views and often felt misunderstood within the court. The expectations placed upon him were immense, and over time, the pressure began to weigh heavily upon him. Then, in 1889, tragedy struck. In the winter of that year, a shocking discovery was made at a remote hunting lodge called Mayerling. Crown Prince Rudolf was found dead. Beside him lay the body of his young companion, Baroness Mary Wetzera. The official explanation was suicide. But the mysterious circumstances quickly sparked rumors of conspiracy. Even today, historians debate what truly happened that night. For Elizabeth, the details did not matter. Her beloved son was gone. The tragedy broke something inside her. From that moment forward, she wore only black clothing. Not for a season of mourning, but for the rest of her life. She avoided the Austrian court almost completely, and instead, she traveled endlessly across Europe. In the years that followed, Elizabeth continued her restless travels across Europe. From Mediterranean islands to quiet mountain towns, she rarely remained in one place for long. It was during one of these journeys, in September 1898, that the Wandering Empress arrived in the lakeside city of Geneva. She traveled under an assumed name, hoping to avoid attention. But fate had placed another visitor in the city that day, an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He believed kings and queens represented injustice. He hoped to assassinate a royal figure to make a political statement. When he learned that the Empress of Austria was staying nearby, he chose her as his target. On the morning of September 10th, Elizabeth walked toward the lakeside to board a steamship. Suddenly, Lucchini rushed forward. He stabbed her with a sharpened metal file. The wound seemed small, and at first the Empress did not realize the seriousness of the attack. She continued walking. Only minutes later did she collapse. The blade had pierced her heart. Within a short time, Empress Elisabeth of Austria was dead. She was 60 years old. Today, the image of Empress Sisi still fascinates the world. Paintings show a radiant young woman with flowing hair and delicate features, but behind the beauty was a life marked by loneliness and longing. She had married an emperor who loved her deeply, yet the world he ruled was one she could never truly accept. She searched for freedom through travel, poetry, and solitude, and after the death of her beloved son, she wandered across Europe like a restless spirit. The empire she once represented has long vanished, but the story of the Wandering Empress remains. Because beneath the crown and the legend, there was simply a human life, a life shaped by love, tragedy, and the quiet search for freedom. And in that quiet search for freedom, Empress Sisi became something more than a queen. She became a symbol of a life lived between crown and escape, a wandering empress whose story still lingers in the shadows of history.